Bradford was like in 1960 when you came here?
Well, in terms of people, and well, I think that we have to look at that in more than one way. If you look at from the industrial side, there was a lot of industry because there was mills on all the streets you could find. I mean, to say you look at places like Canal Road, Valley Road, and Thornton Road, and those places, nearly every other couple of steps was another mill. So on terms of industries, you had loads and loads of industries, jobs and so on. You didn't have a problem. You could leave one job and walk into another. Might not be highly paid, but it would have been a job. So on the industrial side, it was healthy. If you look at the streets and the houses and so on, the houses were big and cold and poorly painted, either in black or some of those most dark, obnoxious colors that presented a dreary outlook. The big chimneys belched out smokes that made everything dingy and black and so on. So as far as that side was concerned, it was a terrible looking sight to look around and see. Everything seemed to be covered with smoke and ash and so on from the various industry around, and that never changed until they brought in the smokeless zone, where naturally you couldn't burn those kind of things, and change the whole look of that. In terms of people, people was very, very poor. I was surprised to see that within England that people was here who from working families where husbands and so on was working, and they were not much better off than we that were in the West Indies. I mean, to say some of them didn't have a suit. Most of them rented from the various corporations, the local authority houses and so on. And there were really a lot of poor people that surprised me at the time. So in terms of the standard of living, for me it was very low for a country which was supposed to be so prosperous and dominated a massive part of the world. You couldn't believe, and Bradford as one of the industrial cities with people in the position that they were in. So in terms of prosperity for the people, although we are, have a higher unemployment situation, people of today live at about 50 times higher in terms of standard of living and so on than they were when I came here. Everybody has carpet right through, fitted carpet right through the houses. Everybody got all the mod cons, televisions and so on. Most people never had that. Some of them had a little lino square on the floors that had a house, and they might have had a little radio, and that was about it. You know, the things like fridges and so on, no one didn't have. They didn't have no electric kettles and so on. There were none of those mod cons. A lot of people relied a great deal on the fish and chip shops for a meal, a substantial meal. People relied a great deal on this fat you get from the animals to help make the sandwiches and so on. So for me, in terms of standard of living and so on, it was a very poor for people, and it was a shock to me to see people in the city living at such a low level. I could understand it in the West Indies and certain parts of Africa because all the resources were pulled out. But for the country where I was receiving the resources, I didn't believe they had so much poverty.
Whereabouts in Bradford did you initially live?
My first place was in St. Mary's Terrace, that is just up from the Children's Hospital. And I lived there for about a year. Then I moved down to Bellevue, from Bellevue to Southfield Square, until I then went back to St. Mary's, and then I bought my own little terrace house. So it was always in the Manningham area most of the time that I lived.
So where were the black people concentrated at the time?
Most of the black people lived in the Manningham area. That means on Lum Lane and those things right up to the St. Mary's area. Manningham Lane on both sides, Lum Lane on both sides. Nearly all the black people lived in that area. In the 60s up to, I say right through the 60s. They only started to move out after the latter part of the 60s, the early 70s, when they were able to buy better houses and so on, because you must remember that in the early days we didn't get mortgages, and when you did get a mortgage, you only got a mortgage in that area because the whites didn't want that area. So it was only when that things were changing a little bit that they were able to get away from the Manningham area. But most, if you wanted to see anyone, you could guarantee walking down Lum Lane till you get to the, which is the John Street Market now, which was an open market at the time, that if you didn't see them in that area, you wouldn't see them easily. Because most of the shopping was done either in the John Street Market or on the Lum Lane area.
What was the community like then, the black community?
Fairly close. They had to be because naturally there weren't many blacks around, especially in the early 60s. The black community grew after 65, coming back to the 70s. But in the 60s when I came, you could actually reckon the few blacks that was around. And you had to be close if you wanted to survive, because you would get attacked if you were walking on your own. So you would find most blacks walking 2 or 3 together. It was the safest way to get around.
Was that racial attack?
Yeah. So even if when you're going out at Friday nights or Saturday nights, you get a few mates to go to have a drink. You never go on your own, because if you did, you have a very good chance of getting beaten up. But in those early days, you had to go with someone else.
So what kind of social activities did you get up to?
It was limited, because I mean to say, we didn't have no center or anything like that, and the places that people would meet was in the pubs. It was the same White Swan. It was the Barracks, which is one opposite. They've changed its name since. Then you had the Bellevue. So it was those 3 pubs carried most of the blacks. Then down in town, you had the Wine Lodge that catered for quite a few, and 1 or 2 of those in that same place. But then you had the house parties, which didn't go down very well, and people do everything to stop from the blacks having. But that was the most thing that people could do, and then people would get together in one another homes and play maybe a game of dominoes and sit down and watch television together or so. But as the kind of things that are open to black people now wasn't open then. You had to live very tight and very close. So you see a few men or a few lads get together and would meet at somebody's flat or home and have some get the dominoes or some cards, and then they would meet at the next house the following week, and that is how it operated. For those that were fortunate to have a house, you would find that people would meet there regularly and talk over all times, things that happened over the week or the weeks, and things that happen at home. But as far as the kind of recreation that we can have now, because of the various facilities we've got, there was none of that around.
So did they tend to group up in terms of people from the same island, or on a wider scale? Wider
scale, because you would just like to see another black face. It doesn't matter. Islands never come into it. When you saw, you walking down the street and you saw another black face, it is like seeing something appear from heaven. You just wanted to know that person. You know, the last thing you think about which part he come from. It didn't matter if he came from the moon, because it wasn't a lot of black faces around. And when you saw another, hi brother, that was all. I mean, I've known a lot of people that is only recently I know where they came from. Because that didn't come into it. You just wanted to know that, hey, you've got another black, you've got another colleague, you've got another friend in the area, that made you feel a bit more secure. Because on your own, you was out on a limb. On your own, you could be beaten up. you know. So you couldn't afford the luxury of saying I come from Dominica or Barbados or Jamaica. You just know that you were another black. And I think that was good in a lot of ways because it gave us a great deal of strength in those years when you were under attack because your numbers were so small. And if you were walking down the streets and somebody attacked another black, you didn't wait to find out if he would attack you. You would get stuck in, and you would expect that same support from him. So in those early years, that was the code that we lived under. You didn't have to tell a black if he passing down the road and see another black getting beaten up that he should help. He knew exactly what to do. So it came a time when they decided to leave us alone because naturally it was made clear that any black you attack them all. And a fellow didn't come and ask who interfere, that didn't come into it.
So were you yourself ever attacked or did you have to?
Oh yes, I was attacked quite a few times. I was never on my own. And the last time it was four of us who was walking up the Church Street, which is coming on to St. Mary's, and a group of youngsters, about a dozen, attacked us, which was one heck of a brawl. And in the end, we gave them a fairly good hiding, and they ran off. And I think that, if I can remember, that's the last time. How long ago it is, I don't really know, but it's quite a long time. But in recent years, I think the only people who has tried in any way to provoke me has been the police. And not in recent years either. Well, only once, I think they stopped me, I think this year, but which tried to provoke me a bit with my car. But as a rule, I don't get any problems now because I think I've got to a stage where I'm very well known.
Can you tell me what was the media's reaction? How did the media project us in those days?
Worse than they do now, because they know they didn't have anyone to challenge them. And I don't know if you've ever seen that thing we call Black. And you must have seen some of the news that is given on that. Every week you would hear a number of statements by the press and see a number of things written up that was, terribly untrue, and anything that a black person was in was either a riot or a war or something like that. Blacks never had a chance as far as the press was concerned, and I mean to say it is only in recent years that they realize that we have been challenging them, and there's some little restraint on some of the things that they would print and say on the media and so on. But in the early days, they had license to do and say whatever they like, and they really went ahead and done it. There was no body to stop them. There was no law to do anything about it because, the race relation law only came in a lot, 76, that really got going. But the early law didn't even have any teeth. I mean, they say this one doesn't even, the amendments and so on doesn't really have much teeth to it because you've got to prove everything. Even if somebody halfway murder you, you've still got to prove that it is a racial attack. And everybody can see it except the law as it stands today. Never mind verbal attacks. You had little or no chance of preventing them. And they knew that you could not really take them to court easily because the cost of carrying through a case like that, it runs into thousands of pounds. So what chance do you have when the law doesn't protect you in that way? So they had, I say, the freedom to do whatever they like and print whatever they like. And they say every day you could see things in the press. I think the only thing was that blacks at the time was prepared to accept it because we never saw the sense of challenge since we believed that we wouldn't have been in this country for a very long time. When we realized that we had come unstuck and we had to be here and there was no way out, then it was time to start challenging the various things. that was said and done to us. But in the early days, there was only a few people challenging things, and that was on the individual scale. If somebody attack you on personally at work or something like that, you've done something about it in your own way. But a collective approach to bringing about changes and so on, that was never really on, because we didn't believe we would have been here 20 odd years after. So why bother about something when you're not going to be around? But we found that that was a mistake in itself, because we didn't foresee the implications that it would have caused at latter years.
So how did the media view of us affect black people?
Well, the way how they presented us as simple, happy-go-lucky people has made people look at us as inferior, and that give them the position that they could do whatever they like and take any liberties with us, and we wouldn't know what people are doing to us. If we did, we wouldn't be able to do nothing about it, and those kind of things. So that actually laid a foundation for the indigenous population to take liberties with us. It was only when it came that we had sufficient and said, no, we've had sufficient of that you start to really put a break on that. But most of the things that has taken place against us, and most of the thing has been sown by the media, and that means television and radio and the various newspapers, who has written a lot of, I would say, hogwash about blacks and the way how they lived and what they came from and all that kind of thing. And people literally believed it. I mean, they say there were people who believed that we had tails, you know, who believed that you were still capable of cannibalism or something like that. And you would find that when you walk in the street, your child would be looking at you like that and frightened, because they're being told that you would eat them or something like that. So it was only in recent years when that has actually changed. And when people realized that you could lead an intelligent conversation, that you could write a decent letter, then that, you know, if you go to places like the tax office and you sign your name or something that was well written, you could see the shock on the face, you know, because naturally they didn't expect you to be able to write your name, you know, and to express yourself, you know, in a clear English and so on, and present anything to them. That wasn't expected of you. And that was because of how the media had projected you.
What kind of adjustments did you have to make towards living in this place?
Oh, I think in every way that one had to adjust in so many ways that it is actually impossible to say all the things that you had to actually do. If we look at the way that we had to, looking at even normal speech, most of us had to drop most of our way of speaking in the West Indies, because if you phrased some things certain ways, they would make fun of it. Not that they didn't understand you, but they made fun of it. So you gradually adapted the way how you speak. And you find that even in your speech, you were adapting with each group that you were with. Because if you were in the Yorkshire group, you would find that you were speaking a bit like the Yorkshire group. And if you then find yourself in a Birmingham group, you would find yourself adjusting again. So you were, even on the matter of speech, you were constantly changing. The way you eat, I think you had to change, because when we first came to this country, a lot of the things that you can get today, you couldn't get. And to live on potatoes nearly all the time, fried, cooked, chipped, and so on, was one of the ways that you had to adjust. The way you dress, they never wore bright colors, and you came from the West Indies with all these pretty sport shirts and so on, and found that they had a lot of dark colors, the trousers and so on, all dark grey. Not, you wouldn't even get a color like blue like this, whether those charcoal grey or black thing. So you see anyone dressed who was in a charcoal suit or a black suit. And we brought light fawn color suits, set up curtains and those kind of, attractive looking colors, and found that when you wear them, people look at you if you come from Mars. So naturally you started to change because you don't want to be so conspicuous. We had two-tone shoes and so on, brown and black, and two-color different browns and so on, and even black and white, brown and white. When you wore them in this country, everybody laughed and thought it was funny. Now everybody is wearing them, but we actually introduced it, and then we had to change, and we're all plain blacks and so on. So it was all that you had to go through. There was a constant, change in everything that you actually grew up doing. You found that you had to actually give up, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to survive in the environment, because it was so hostile to everything you do. Well, I'll give you a simple example, even how with speech. That I can remember once we were in this pub down in town. We used to call it the King's Head. It's changed its name because a lot of the pubs now have changed the names, and since they've gone into wine bar and so on. And we were sat, myself and two other friends, and there were some girls and an Italian bloke that used to work with me. And this bloke, I don't know if he could speak half a dozen words of English. But amazingly, those white girls pretend they could understand him better than they could understand us, because naturally he was white. We spoke English. He couldn't. But they pretend that they could understand him. Because he was white, he was of a higher intelligence and naturally could speak a language that he couldn't even understand. So they could pretend they could understand him and they couldn't understand us. So there's the level of how we had seen black people. They couldn't admit to be able to understand us who were speaking English. But they could admit to understand a language that they didn't. So those are the kind of things that you had to put up with. So naturally, you had to adapt, and you were constantly adapting everything you do. In every way, you found that you were living, just adjusting and adapting here and there. I do not think there are any of us who have came to this country or many of us who have actually retained most of the things that they left home with. Some of us try to revert back to some of the things, but you've been so contaminated with all the things around you over the number of years that no matter how you try, now that you are that way. So you remember some of the things that you used to be, and you try to it. But the things that you've been for the last 20 or so years still surround you. And you're actually, in a lot of ways, living in two worlds.
Was there any black businesses in the early days?
No. Black business, even up to now, is still a rarity in this part of the country. The only black businesses that was around was, I think, later in the late 60s, early 70s, where there was a few clubs. But the shops that even the Asians and so on has come fairly late. I mean, they say, and those came, I think, the late 60s and early 70s as well. But in those early 60s, everything was owned, as far as I can remember, by whites, whether it be Poles, Italians, or English, but not in the Bradford area. And as you can see, even up to today, the few businesses that are around, which is even owned by the Asians, are not very big business in terms of what real businesses are. And those that do have big businesses actually came into this country as millionaires before or something like that. Very few has ever been able to establish a business from a working situation in this country, because the banks do not entertain you. They'll lend you 500-600 or so pounds, or maybe 1,000. But when you're talking about money for a business, that's a different kettle of fish.
So where did you get food that we're used to, or could you not get them?
Oh, you couldn't get that not in the early days. That came, years and years after. The first thing that we did get then was rice, but that came, I think, around the mid-60s, where you could get the proper rice for cooking. But the early part of the 60s, you got a fat grain rice, which was just suitable for making sweets and so on. We're making rice pudding, because that was the only way the English people eat rice. That when you talk about cooking rice, they laughed. Now they're telling you how to cook it, but they didn't know how to. They didn't even know they had rice that you could cook, because they had only seen the fat grain rice for making rice pudding. Yams and sweet potatoes come even a lot later. I don't think you've been getting yams and sweet potatoes and thing much longer than about 10 years or so, maybe a bit more, but not much more than that.
So what about businesses like hairdressers?
There was one West Indian bloke, Alan Reddy, who tried to start a business about, 15 or so years back. But upwards to now, I mean to say, we don't have a decent West Indian hairdressing. There's now Maureen is in the process of having one, and Calma runs a little thing from the bookshop. But that is not a real hairdressing salon, and we never had one. So even to have proper things for your hair, that wasn't possible. All that has only happened within